Hi there, this is Risa from Core Integrity with Soul Science. So let's talk about the second ray, which is also the second major ray of aspect with rays 1 and 3, the first three. And the second ray is called the ray of love wisdom. Two aspects. The second ray is a magnetic ray. It is that which draws substance to itself and creates the matrix within which forms can come into manifestation. So if we think about the first ray that we previously explored as that initiating ray, number one, that which brings life into being through single-pointed force, then the second ray comes out of that initiating spirit and creates that unified field where life, the heartbeat of life can occur. The second ray is particularly important to us, to all individuals, even if you may not temperamentally be a significantly second ray type of individual, because our actual solar system as a being unto itself is a second ray system. The second ray being, the solar logos. So in that way, we have this particular emphasis as human beings on love. Love as the major life principle, or love as a major aspect of God. Love is a magnetic force. If we think also about how I think too about gravity and that way of pulling things into itself. The sun itself, which is a second ray entity, draws into itself those planetary bodies that revolve around it. Once again, the heart of the solar system. And then we think about the heart in the human being as a central emanating force, a healing force. So the second ray of love wisdom has a lot to do with healing and a lot to do with love and inclusion, inclusivity, diversity in terms of welcoming all forms of life. And once again, coming back to this idea of matrix, it's a little bit more of a feminine aspect if we compare that first ray as an initiating and penetrative spirit, which is a little bit more of a masculine and inseminating force. The second ray is that more womb aspect, or the feminine aspect, in terms of creating that contained field which nourishes and nurtures and produces life. So that's the love aspect, and the wisdom aspect has to do with that all inclusion of all the forces insofar as it pertains to an understanding of all life, an understanding of the relationships between all the moving parts of this cohesive larger system. So the wisdom aspect speaks to the illuminating principle of the second ray, understanding, and with love and wisdom comes a great deal of sensitivity. So whereas some of the vices of the first ray can be a little bit self-obsessed or insensitive, the second ray is quite opposite to that in being super sensitive, because it is feeling that greater cosmic entity. It is feeling all the different moving parts of the greater system. So it is very welcoming in that way. It can be quite an intuitive ray for that reason too, whereas the first ray can be a great inspirer and a great mover and shaker and a great leader. That second ray is really that ray which brings in the part that can see and feel everything that's moving within that system, whereas that first ray may be pushing it forward or leading that system. So it's an extremely cohesive ray. It has a lot to do with synthesis and right relationship, which is seen in the signs that it expresses through astrologically, which we'll get to shortly. But let's consider some of the virtues and vices. So yes, sensitivity, inclusiveness, diversity, welcoming, nourishment, healing. These are all positive expressions of the second ray. And affection. On the wisdom aspect, if one expresses more on that wisdom line, it can be more the love of truth, understanding, keen insight, utilizing that sensitivity to be able to discern and ascertain what's this movement here and how does that relate to that and how do we bring this together and what's specifically needed for that particular part. That's where it gets a little bit more refined in terms of the wisdom or the understanding and the knowledge aspect. Love of truth. So if we take those qualities, those positive qualities, and we see them through the shadow lens as vices, then what we can see with the second ray can be sometimes too affectionate, and sometimes in that tendency towards magnetism, it can have a hard time letting go. So personal attachments or applying love in too much of a forceful way, not forceful exactly, but love applied in the wrong places, perhaps not being able to let go of a relationship if it's no longer relevant or useful, whereas the first ray person has no problem doing that, right? So because of the magnifying or the magnetizing force of the second ray, it can hold on to things. And in that sensitivity, that almost telepathic and empathic, and really the word empath is really most aptly applied to the second ray type of person because of that sensitivity. But with that shadow of the sensitivity being that sometimes an unawakened second ray person can be picking up on, absorbing, and unconsciously interpreting a soup of all these other forces and influences coming actually from other people or the collective that don't actually belong to the individual. So it can take quite a lot of work to develop the mind and become synthesized and integrated enough and have enough boundaries, which of course can be a problem for a second ray type of person, to the degree that it expresses more on that love angle. The boundaries are important to be able to go, actually, is this mine? Is this actually a grief and depression that is my personal story, or am I picking it up from elsewhere? That overly sensitive and compassionate attitude that creates an impractical suffering where you're just constantly in a soup of all these sorts of negative feelings. So sensitivity to negativity. We can also see that even expressed to the degree that we see the second ray as a bit more feminine, and actually from a biological perspective, women tend to be more sensitive to negative emotion and all these kinds of things, right? So of course, it's not just about women. This is more of a second ray character trait, so it could easily include men as well. But we can just see that core rayological expression even at the biological level. So a difficulty letting things go, a difficulty in being overly empathic without having the discernment to go along with that, and therefore getting stuck in negativity, depression, anxiety, and more so self-hatred or poor self-esteem. That's much more of an issue with a second ray person, whereas the first ray person can have more of that shadow of self-inflation. I'm really amazing, I'm really good, and maybe even overemphasizing their achievements. The second ray person may not be able to acknowledge their achievements at all, or even if they produce something really wonderful, there can still be that negativity, or it's not good enough, or it wasn't ready, or I needed to know more of this. So that neuroticism, and that it's an inverse kind of egocentrism where it's not so much self-obsession or inflation, or I'm so good, but it's an egocentrism insofar as it's a constant negative attitude towards oneself, which can make one be really impractical and then struggle with inertia, which is another second ray shadow. Being inert, being unable to move with life because of having to deal with so much negative energy. And I can say that that's for sure for myself, being quite a second ray type of individual. That's been something to overcome. So that's the shadow of the love aspect, and the shadow of the wisdom aspect actually can express a little bit differently, where the wisdom aspect in its shadow can express a kind of cold detachment where you're seeing everything from the bigger picture and you may have a lot of knowledge, but using that as an excuse to emotionally distance oneself. So it's almost the opposite effect. There's still that sensitivity in terms of the knowledge or the intuitive understanding, but it's a pulling back. and being a bit cold and detached and removing oneself from personal feeling. So with the love wisdom ray, that second ray, you want to have that right relationship where the wisdom can help develop that discernment and making the proper choices and seeing the right relationship. And the love aspect can bring that personal magnetic sense of inclusion. Too much magnetism in its shadow, overly empathic, maybe a bit of a pushover, can get walked on easily and a bit depressive. And too much wisdom, a little bit too cold and distant and a bit all about knowledge as a bit of a dry, almost that bookworm sort of academic dryness, right? So I think that's probably pretty good for the virtues and vices of the second ray. Let's go to the signs, the astrological signs that the second ray moves through. Once again, a ray moves always through 3 signs in the zodiac. So the first sign that expresses the second ray is Gemini. And Gemini is a purely second ray sign. Most of the signs express more than one ray, but it's one of those fewer signs that just expresses the second ray. Gemini, it can be sometimes seen to be a bit polarizing and a bit sometimes combative, but in its solarized or matured state, it is very synthesizing, because you have that, and a key word for the second ray is synthesis, the bringing together of the opposites, the bringing the two. And so that's why we see in its first level of rulership in Gemini, which is Mercury, the this and that, this thing and that thing, which could also be seen as it expresses through Gemini as a wisdom aspect to understand the two parts. But then the soul ruler is Venus, and Venus is a synthesizing planet. So then we see in Gemini the two are brought together and they become the one. And so Gemini is the sign of, a great sign of love and wisdom. You can even see some of the shadows of that second ray through Gemini in terms of it being a bit scattered. And I didn't mention this in the vices, but one of the vices for the second ray can be learning for learning's sake and indiscriminate learning. So, oh, this, oh, that, but there's no broader cohesion or sense of direction, a lack of focus, right? Because if we've got the first ray as that focus, then the second ray can sometimes lack a bit of that directional movement, and hence the inertia element again. So we can see some of that expressed through Gemini, insofar as Gemini can sometimes be a little bit superficial in terms of a little bit here, a little bit there, So the second ray through Gemini. And there's also Virgo, where it is the mother sign. Virgo is the Virgin Mother, right? Mother Mary, the great sign of gestation and the bringing together of the energies of the form life to create the child, as the mother does in her body. So the second ray is considered very strong in Virgo. And the final sign is Pisces. So interesting that they're all mutable signs. So that hints also to the nature of the second ray in terms of its fluidity. Whereas with the first ray, we had 2 cardinal signs and a fixed sign, right? Aries, Capricorn, Leo. And all of the signs that the second ray expresses through are mutable. And so we have that movement and the diversity that comes with mutability, because we're moving from here to here to here to here. And in that, I'm developing that sensitivity which can feel and include all of the multitude of perspectives and qualities of life. So those are the 3. In Pisces, it's a little bit more of that collectivized compassion, right? And that's the suffering. So the Pisces can sometimes be known to be very depressive in that way. And in Virgo, Virgo is the great healing sign, the great sign that rules all healing professions. So that bringing together of the different parts to heal and create a cohesive whole. And in Gemini, it's more of that, the knowledge or the wisdom or understanding how things come together in a more archetypal or fundamental sense. So that's the second ray through the signs. And for the final point of today's video, the planets, or the planetary entities, the solar system entities that express the second ray are the Sun and Jupiter. And it's interesting because remember what I said at the beginning about the second ray being very pivotal and important for all human beings, even if it's not significant to you temperamentally, because we come from a solar system that expresses, above all else, the second ray. And we can see how significant the sun is astrologically, because the sun sign is really considered the home base in astrology, which is partly why sun sign astrology got very popular, although it's not very specific and doesn't really tell you anything really specific about an individual. But the sun sign as that home base, that natural point of rest, the natural equipment that one inherits, and the sun sign often representing, and representing in esoteric astrology as well, the basic center of the personality. So once again, that sense of a centrality with the second ray as it expresses through the sun, the home base, and the heart of the sun, or the heart of an individual, the beating, pulsing center. And in Jupiter, that second ray, the fact that Jupiter is a co-ruler of the second ray, also points to Jupiter's significance, where actually, while it's not the same as describing a specific temperamental, individualized aspect of the individual, Jupiter represents the overall spiritual work of the life, at least in the esoteric chart. For the soul awakening individual, Jupiter's sign and house placement is telling you something about your overall spiritual works, the spiritual contribution that's being made in a broader sense. So Jupiter is very significant in that way. It's not so much this central sun at the individual level, but it is showing a centralizing force of the greater contributional spiritual work of an individual. So I hope you enjoyed this introductory video to the second ray. I hope you learned something. And yeah, you can always look to the sun sign, to Jupiter as well, and you can look to Gemini, Virgo, Pisces in your chart and see what houses they're ruling to get more of a sense of where that second ray inclusive and synthesizing energy may be expressing itself through you. Okay, catch you next time.